Good morning, and I'd like to welcome everybody back to part 2 of the budget discussions that we started on Wednesday, February 3rd. It is now February 5th, where we will be going over some budget options. This is going to be a staff presentation and just continuing with the meeting that we had on Wednesday. But before we do that, I would like to go through a audio and visual check for all of the councillors. So let's start with Councillor Daigle-Gammon. Good morning.
Morning, Mr. Chair. Ready for the meeting today.
Good stuff. Thank you. Councillor Hensby.
Present and accounted for, and if Councillor Smith and Cuddle are on the line, please check your emails. Thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Kent, District 3.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am here and ready for a long day.
Yes. Hopefully not too long. Councillor Porter, District 4.
Good morning, everyone. Good to be here. Trish here from District 4, and happy to see the sun again.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Councillor Austin, District 5.
I'm here, Mr. Chair, ready to go. Good
stuff. Thank you very much. Councillor Mancini, District 6.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and colleagues. All set to go.
Good stuff. Thank you. Councillor Mason, District 7. Are you with us yet? Okay. Councillor Smith, District 8.
Here, ready.
Super. Thank you very much. Councillor Cleary sends his regrets. So Councillor Morse, District 10.
Here and raring to go. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning. And Councillor Cuddle, District 11.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. Councillor Stoddard, District 12.
Good morning, Mr. Mayor and fellow colleagues. Coming to you from Timberley, Lakeside, Beachville, Clayton Park West, and Wedgwood. A little bit of history. I've got the Barbados flag behind me.
Good stuff.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. District 13, Councillor Lovelace.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. Good morning, colleagues. Coming to you live from Hams Plain St. Margaret's this morning.
There we go. Thank you. District 14, Councillor Blackburn.
Hello, good morning, everybody, and great to be here, pencil sharpened and ready for the meeting of the Math Club.
There we go. Thank you very much. District 16, Deputy Mayor Outfit.
Good morning, all. I'm feeling nostalgic today. I've got my Bedford Days fleece on, and I'm eating an Izzy's bagel, so promoting the heck out of Bedford today. But good morning, all, and ready to get to work.
Good stuff. Thank you. And Mayor Savage.
Good to go, Chair. Thank you. And good morning, colleagues.
Good stuff. Thank you. And Councillor Mason, are you with us yet? Okay. Hopefully, Councillor Mason will be able to join us shortly. At this point, I'm going to hand it over to the CAO and the CFO for our presentation on the budget options. Thank you very much.
Well, good morning, everyone. Mr. Mayor, Mr. Chair Russell, members of council, CFO Jane Fraser, executive directors, ladies and gentlemen, children of all ages. Happy Friday. So just to kick us off, I will disclose this, that Jane and I were chatting last week about how to best kick off the Super Bowl weekend. So as usual, when Jane and I chat, we talk about lots of options, and many options were considered about how to kick this weekend off, and we ultimately agreed there would be no better way to kick off that weekend than talk about budgets, budget options, and financial risk. So such fun we're going to have today. So thank you very much for joining us today. But on a more serious note, after receiving feedback from a number of you, we thought it would be helpful to share this budget guide to explain the process now that you've had the opportunity to go through some business unit budget sessions this past Wednesday. I also asked Jane and her team to provide some tax rate options for information purposes only today. I will say that I'm not seeking a different budget target today from council. Jane and I feel it's prudent for Budget Committee of the whole to hear and adjudicate on each business unit budget and consider all the items on the budget adjustment list, and then consider the level at which council sets the average tax impacts for both residential and commercial properties. So for your information, we have 3 scenarios that we'll present after this sort of budget tutorial of sorts. We have three scenarios to show you and to discuss with you, and we'll speak to the risks associated with those scenarios as well. So the current recommended average tax bill increase of 1.9%, what the impact would be if the average tax bill increased by CPI, or Consumer Price Index, for 2021, and then the impacts if the average tax bill was held at last year's rate or no increase. So slide 2, please. So first, we're going to present information on the art of budgeting. So the budget is government's main policy document. So it shows the public what is important. It is where the money is intended to go. It's also important to remember that the budget is a plan at a point in time. It will not be perfect because it is based on assumptions and estimates. In other words, the actual financial results rarely match up precisely with the budget plan given the complexity and dynamic nature of our operations. So to that point, throughout the year, accuracy to the budget is actually compared to quarterly projections. And the final summary occurs at year end with the audited financial statements. So for those of you who are new here, we bring quarterly financial projections through to the Audit and Finance Standing Committee of Council. And then those are then ultimately shared with all of Council. So you'll see quarterly projections as we move through the year. And of course, at the end of the year, we bring in the external auditors who audit our financial statements and present the annual audited statements to Council. And then Council gets to adjudicate on those audited financial statements and resolves to accept them or reject them, or whatever the case may be, or ask questions. Slide 3, please. So there's very little flexibility in the annual budget process. And what I mean by that is that the majority of operating costs are fixed, meaning we have to pay them due to contractual obligations or legislation or regulation or some bylaw requirement or administrative order requirement. So discretionary costs are where the flexibility is to a certain extent. And then there are one-time costs, which are either budgeted for or come in outside of the budget process. And these are large grants, as an example. And HRM has approximately $1 billion in operating costs. So that's the size of the budget. It's a very significant operation and a complex budget. So if you get a little lost, don't worry. It's very complex to understand because there's so many moving parts, there's so many different expenditure types, there's so many different revenue streams. So we'll do our best to explain all of those to you as we move forward today and as we move forward through the budget process and as you get to adopt a budget. So on slide 4, these are examples of some fixed or committed costs, and you can see it's kind of a long list. So those things are like salaries and wages, RCMP costs that are fixed by contract, signed contracts for snow removal, cleaning, solid waste, commodities, lease costs, provincial mandatory contributions, which are significant, debt payments of principal interest. Those are your committed costs or your fixed costs, right? So they account for about 88% of the budget. And there are variations from year to year in those costs. For example, the electricity costs or usage will fluctuate, but we do have to pay the electric bill. We have no other choice. And of course, salaries are an ongoing expense as well. So the majority of the costs are part of an ongoing service delivery, and you can change the budget amount by changing the service. And you'll recall, when Jane and I had conversations with you earlier, and in terms of the fiscal framework and some of these strategies that we're looking forward, we're looking at exploring the idea of service-based budgeting. For now, when you think about services and budgets, many of these kinds of fixed costs can only be adjusted really by service cuts. So for example, you could reduce salary by wage freezes or layoffs, by reducing services, but these are drastic long-term measures as opposed to small reduction in service delivery. And of course, collective agreements play into that and have to be considered, obviously. And there are no options with principal interest repayment either in the short term. In the longer term, you can reduce that repayment by taking out obviously less debt, right? Slide 5, please. So discretionary costs account for about 12% of HRM's operating budget, which is kind of a small percentage, but when you look at the dollar amount, it's $122 million, which is a large dollar amount. So typically when business units are asked to meet their target, these are the areas they go to, right? So they go to things like travel and training and services for new homes and properties, or special projects, or consultants, or capital from operating, or transfers from reserves. Those are the areas that we typically go to when we're looking at reducing business unit expenditures. So the flip side of the argument is that reducing spending in these areas may have an impact on services, and in some cases the recommendation may be to stop a service if it is viewed as being overserved. So it's a question of balance and a question of pros and cons and choices by council when it comes to those kinds of discretionary expenses. So you'll hear staff talk about one-time items, and those tend to be unusual outside of the normal process, as was mentioned earlier. So finance always likes to match expense timeline with revenue timeline. So one-time revenue should be used to fund one-time expenses. And many times, depending on the size of it, those one-time expenses, sometimes they're funded through reserves, sometimes through debt, or in the actual operating budget itself if we have capacity within the operating budget, within the envelopes. So slide 6, please. So property tax is the most stable stream that the municipality has. That's the most stable revenue stream that we have. And of course, deed transfer tax is a volatile revenue source, with both investment income and deed transfer, and investment income and the deed transfer tax are actually impacted by the economy. And then there are fares and fees as determined by demand. So, parks and recreation and transit are where many of our fares and fees reside. Planning and development for building permits. So fines and fees are also used to offset service costs somewhat, but it's not 100% cost recovery. Or it may be used to influence behavior in some cases, right? So we also receive a relatively small amount of revenue from government transfers. These are transfers from federal and provincial governments. Slide 7, please. So except for transfers, all these revenues have been impacted by COVID. As an example, with transit fares, the budget amount in March 2021 was $36 million, and we are not projected to hit that level again until 23-24 at the earliest. So I'll just I'll repeat that again. We were budgeted in March 2021, 36 million, and we're not going to hit that level until 2023-24. Right now, we're tracking at about high 40s, 47, 48% of our previous ridership. So that's going to take a while to recover, but it's a significant amount of money that impacts our revenue streams. So all these revenues that we're talking about on the slide account for about $116 million, or 12% of the budget, which is almost the same number as our discretionary costs, coincidentally, actually. Slide 8, please. So taxes, by far, are their main source of revenue. Property taxes account for 83% of the revenue base, and that is why we match the assessment base and changes in tax rates so closely. There's a knockoff impact to changes, meaning the changes tend to ripple throughout the years, right? So 5%, and when I should go back a little bit on that, on the knockoff bit, right? So when you think about changes to tax rates and the assessment base, and Jane is going to get into this as we go through the options. So if you look at changes this year, you really have to consider what that means in year 3 and 4, right? But we've got a 4-year fiscal framework. So what we do this year is going to have a direct impact on the 4th year, right? So what we've been trying to do in trying to be fiscally conservative in terms of, and to try to even out the spikes in rates and average tax payable, what our fiscal framework is attempting to do. And you'll recall that back in that conversation, that's what we were showing you. We were showing you sort of a leveling out of the average tax payable to the extent that we can forecast and plan for. So when we talk about knockoff impact, that's what we're talking about. It's meaning that changes tend to ripple out throughout the years, and what you do today has an impact on what you do tomorrow. On D-transfer tax, 5% of our revenues are for D-transfer tax, currently pegged at $46.5 million. The remaining $5 million are revenue sources. It's for things like the stormwater levy and other miscellaneous revenues. So, and as you probably heard before from Jane and I, the D-transfer tax tends to be a very volatile revenue stream, and is one that finance staff looks to when the final budget is pulled together. The question then becomes, is the number too conservative now that we have more accurate numbers or not? So if you think about D-transfer tax, last year we adjusted it up. We did a couple of very significant studies around D-transfer tax, and we concluded and we were comfortable with recommending a higher number to council. In the recast budget, we actually dropped it down, and interestingly enough, we're actually exceeding that recast budget number, given the activity in the economy and sale of properties, particularly commercial properties, primarily. So that's always a bit of a discussion, but we're very fortunate to have a D-transfer tax here. Slide 9, please. So on capital, every capital project has to have a dedicated funding source, and of course that can impact the budget. So capital from operating and the payment of debt are direct impacts to the operating budget, meaning they are included as an expense. You also have operating cost of capital. So if you approve a capital budget, and you'll see that in the sub-sheets, the supplementary sheets, when we present you with the capital budget, you'll see that there's operating cost of capital. And as you approve capital projects this year, that operating cost of capital is factored into all the out years, right? So when Jade and I talk about the knockoff effect, that's also a knockoff effect. So when you think about what you're doing on capital now, has an impact on your operating costs going forward, right? As long as the asset is being maintained and operated, and of course you may have principal interest payments that impact the operating budget as a result, right? So slide 10, please. So we have had several conversations about debt so far, especially in light of the strategic initiatives funding plan, if you recall. And the reality is, to deliver capital projects, certainly significant ones, where the life of the asset is, probably more than 5 years, the debt must be incurred. So the most important thing about debt is that it's affordable, much the same way as you may have a mortgage. So the important thing is that your mortgage is not consuming the majority of your paycheck, right? So these numbers reflect HRM's debt for 2021, and we use that as the start of the analysis on how much debt should be issued for upcoming capital work. And of course, the debt ratio, our current one, is 4.7%, which is very low. The province recommends that municipalities have no more than a 15% debt ratio. But frankly, we're not suggesting HRM moves to that level anytime soon. Rather, there is room to wisely and deliberately assume more debt based on council decisions associated with strategic projects and other capital works that we need in terms of steady good repair. Slide 11, please. So, Mr. Chair, when COVID struck, there was a great uncertainty about whether or not people and businesses would be able to pay their taxes. So this would have resulted in a significant cash flow issue for municipalities. And we worked through the NSFM and the AMA Nova Scotia, and Jane was part of that group that worked on at the AMA Nova Scotia level, and the NSFM, Councillor Mason was actively involved in his conversations with the province through the NSFM, and so was the mayor. We ended up, having the province decide to provide a pool of money for all municipalities in Nova Scotia around short-term loans that would offset some of the cash flow issues that we were having. So in April, we estimated our cash flow could be as short as much as $188 million as the tax bill came. But as the tax bills came in, the percentage paid was much higher than anticipated. And actually that trend continued with the October bill. So we have collected, and this is something that came as a great surprise to both Jane and I. We had assumed that we would collect much less than we did. We collected 96% of total taxes. So there's around $30 million outstanding. Residential is outstanding by about 20 million, and thankfully commercial is outstanding at about 10 million. So to give you a sense of scale, you know, normally in normal years we generally are running around 10 to 12 million dollars in outstanding tax payment receivables at this time of the year. But you know, 96% is not a bad number, and having $30 million outstanding is a very good number given the COVID situation. So with that level of collection, as well as the improved transfer tax revenue and the federal Safe Restart funding, which has been an incredible help, many thanks to the federal government and the province for negotiating that agreement. That federal restart money added to the transfer and the level of collection that we've experienced, we're in very good shape with respect to cash flow, right? So that means that $20.8 million that we were suggesting and built into the fiscal framework that you approved, you know, almost $21 million there, can be used for other purposes. I will also point out, though, that the revenue source for the $20.8 million that we presented to you in the fiscal framework came from reserves. So it's not as if it's a direct drop on the operating side of the house. It was coming in from reserves. It wasn't coming from taxes. But it can be used for other purposes at council's discretion. And Jane will get into more of that in terms of risks associated with the various options we'll present to you today. So before I pass over to Jane, I just want to make a couple of comments on reserves. They're basically our savings accounts, right? Similar to savings accounts, once they're spent, they're gone. So we, you know, HRM Council did a very good job protecting the reserves through COVID, and the approach Council took was to reduce spending rather than to go to reserves, right? So if you'll recall, we reduced spending by about $45 million. Add to that, we were estimating about a $30 million payment on for the short-term loan. So here we are, you know, we preserved our reserves, and we're in fairly good shape going forward. I will also point out that a number of reserves are legislated, such as capital reserves, parkland acquisition, and post-landfill closure costs. Other contractual obligations, such as capital investment agreements with BMO and RBC, are all reserved. So, you know, while we're in good shape in reserve, we have to be careful not to pooch the reserves, because the risks associated with our financial situation are not so much 21-22. They're actually more 22-23 and 23-24. Where there are a number of unknowns going forward in relation to what our tax base is going to look like as a result of appeals by commercial properties, primarily of assessments, right? So when you think about, you know, the commercial market, the commercial real estate market, the vacancy rates, the vacancies of office buildings and retail, restaurants, those types of properties are on the rise, right? So to the extent to which people appeal those taxes will only get felt in probably in 21 and 22, 23, and 23, 24. Because I just want to remind everyone, our assessments lag by 2 years. So the 22, 23 tax base is going to be based on the 2020 experience, which is the COVID time, right? And the extent to which the market experiences any downturn in terms of commercial in 21 is unknown to us right now. We can only guess and have conversations with PVSC. Fortunately for us, our 21-22 tax base saw some good growth, but that was based on the 2019 experience in the real estate market, which was boom time for HRM, pretty much in every district. There's a lot of construction everywhere, right? So on that, I'm going to pass it over to Jane, and she's going to talk to you about and present some issues, some options that we've been working on around average tax bill increases, other than the amount set by council in the fiscal framework. So Jane, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jacques. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about the process. So you had a little bit of that on Wednesday, and really hopefully what this will do is put everything in context for you and answer maybe some questions that you may have had. So the budget at its heart, it's an iterative process. So we keep going through presentations and keep building and adjusting as we go forward. At the end of the day, as Jacques has said and I've said, it is your budget, it's council's budget, and it's council that determines what the tax rate will be. Next slide, please. So we were required by legislation to pass a balanced budget. So that means that we have to raise enough revenue either through tax or non-tax revenue to cover our expenses. It's that simply. It's just that balancing act to make sure that we're in compliance with legislation. Next slide, please. So basically, there's 7 steps that we go through to prepare the budget, and I'll go through each of the steps in more detail in the next slides. Next slide, please. So step 1 is adding up all the costs and all our revenues. So the first thing we look at are the fixed cost, and as Jacques said, these are the ones that we have to pay: salary, contracts, debts, things of those natures. We then look at the discretionary costs. So, you know, things like training, professional development, anything that really you can forego. We look at reserves. What are our commitments for deposits into reserves or withdrawals? How much do we have to put into capital and operating? And then has council given us direction on new services? And if they have, when do we have to implement those new services? We put all of that together, and then what we end up with is the preliminary number for the costs that we're going to be anticipating to incur, and then the revenues. Next slide, please. So step 2 is really where we dig into the tax revenue and we estimate what that's going to be. So once we know what the costs are, we need to figure out the amount of revenue that we're going to generate to present the balanced budget. The majority of this, as you know, is tax revenue. So in order to determine what we think that revenue is going to be, we look at the economic models. We look at the assessment roll. So in December, that's when it comes in, and there's a fair amount of work to unpack what the impacts are. And so we look at what the existing properties are, as well as what the new ones are, or where we've seen some of the growth. So you may recall back in January when we did the fiscal framework, we saw some really significant growth in apartment buildings in HRM, and that really helped with our tax revenue. Staff then make assessments, an assessment of, or an assumption on what the average tax bill would be, and we go through our math. We look at the risks, and then we look at where we think there's some room to make a decision on what it is that we're going to recommend to regional council. So this year, as you know, the recommendation is a 1.9% increase to the average tax bill. And as the CAO has said, you know, this really is the starting point of the deliberation. It's our initial recommendation, and you determine what the final tax rate will be. Next slide, please. So step 3 is tax consideration. So one of the most important things with taxation is competitiveness. So we look at the other jurisdictions. We try to understand what the competition is and how much room is there from a taxation point of view. We don't want to have taxes at a point where businesses are not willing to come to HRM, or residents aren't willing to come, or there's out migration. So competitiveness is definitely a consideration. We always look longer term. So are the changes that we're recommending sustainable over the longer term? So our midterm outlook is 4 years. So it's the current budget plus 3 in fiscal framework. But ideally, what we'd like to do is move out to a 20-year scenario. So we're really talking about a change to a tax rate today, but what does that look like moving forward? The other things that are very important are one-time impacts, and that's really what we're seeing this year in the budget for 21-22. We are benefiting from the federal Safe Restart program. So that was $46 million that HRM received. We're using $15 million in the 2021 budget to offset increased costs from COVID, and then taking the balance, the $31 million in the 21-22 budget. So this is one-time money that we will not have going forward, and that we'll have to make up over the life of the fiscal plan. Next slide, please. Step 4 is where we determine what the budget gap is. And really, when we talk about the gap, what it is we have all of our revenues, we subtract the cost, and 999 times out of 1,000, the operating costs are more than the revenue. The difference is what the gap is. So once we have that and we understand what it is, we need to figure out how we're going to close it. We have to have a balanced budget. So what are the levers that we can pull? Are we going to raise taxes and get additional tax revenue? Reduce discretionary costs? Are we going to reduce fixed costs? Obviously, that would be a longer term play because some of those initiatives are harder to change. But really, at the end of the day, what we do is it's a combination of all of those actions to come up with an estimated way to close the gap. So this year, the gap was $25.3 million. We went to business units and adjusted their targets across all business units for a total of $6 million, which left us with 19.3. And that's it. The 1.9% increase on the average tax bill is just the math to close that $19.3 million gap. Next slide, please. So step 5 is, once finance staff with direction from Jacques, of course, have done our work, we present the fiscal framework. And that's what you saw on January the 13th. And that's really where you get the first look at what staff is recommending as a tax rate. It's the start of the whole process. And you saw that on Wednesday, where we started the deliberation with the business units. The business units come in, we talk about proposed budgets. There was some options for budget changes as well as overs, and then some changes to services that were highlighted on Wednesday. And this is really what you can expect to see going forward. We always start out with the smaller business units and the easier ones to get your, a bit of a cadence and to get used to what the process is. But what you're going to see is as the larger, more operational business units come in, like transit and fire, parks and rec, TPW, is there's going to be an awful lot of detail in their budgets and a lot of explanation as to changes to meet the target, as well as other pressures that they may be having. So we walk through the process, and then what we do is we build the budget adjustment list as we go forward. Next slide, please. So moving into step 6, which is the budget adjustment list, or what we call the BAL. So by motion, council looks at business unit budgets to determine if they want to move either an over or an under to the list. Or maybe you feel that there isn't enough funding in a specific area and you want to increase it. We saw this with the CAO's budget on Wednesday, where there was a motion put forward to increase funding so that there could be 2 newsletters mailed out to constituents. The CAO also had an over on his list for anti-Black racism, and those are both moved to the BAL by motion. So that's really how we build the BAL list. Sometimes there will be a request for additional information. So you may not have enough information to make a decision on an item. So council will formally ask for a briefing note on the topic. Staff will come back with that briefing note with more information for you. And what finance will do is we will indicate the financial implications of that. So we'll say what the impact on the tax rate would be if it was adopted. Sometimes we'll say if it's a one-time or an ongoing cost, and sometimes we may actually recommend a funding source for it on the briefing note. And the purpose of that is so that you have all of the information that's required for your deliberations. Next slide, please. So the final step in the process, after all the business units have presented their budgets and business plans, is debate around the budget adjustment list. This is always left to the end, and the reason for that, obviously, is so that you can see the full impact of everything that's there. We go through one by one, and so council can debate and decide whether or not they want to fund the item on the list. You can fund the item, the full amount that's there. You can fund part of it, or you can say no, given everything that I see on the list now, this item isn't as much of a priority as it was initially. So then that item doesn't move forward. Once we have the final list and the impact to the budget, finance staff go back and we develop a funding plan. So essentially, it's really, I'm going to go back. I'm going to have a look at revenue. So detransfer tax, as Jacques said, is volatile. Is a number that we have in the budget too low? Is there some room that I can take there and increase that amount for additional revenue? What's happening in the economy? Is there a little bit of room on interest rates? Are they coming up higher than we anticipated? Are we going to have a surplus at the end of the year? So is there an opportunity to use that for one-time items? Looking at the expense side of things, have I been too aggressive on some of the expenses? So, for example, loan valuation, given the collections that we're seeing, does it need to be as high as that is? So we look at everything, we put it all together and come back to you with the funding plan and what the impact would be on the tax rate. If the decision is made to reduce taxes, that obviously would be factored in and come back with a plan that follows the direction that we've been given by council. And then we present that to you for decision. You vote on the budget, and after that, we're done. We have the budget for the year. We go away. We produce all the tables and the books. It gets ratified at regional council, and basically we're good to go for another year. So that's essentially the steps to putting the budget. The steps are fairly easy. The conversations and the debate and the decisions that have to get made is where it gets complicated. So next slide, please. So as Jacques said, we've looked at, he's asked me to run a few scenarios for you in response to the conversation about the tax rate that we're hearing, both from the public and from councillors around the table. Next slide, please. So as he said, we have 3 scenarios for you. And just as a refresh, this is what was in the fiscal plan. So it's a residential average tax bill, which recommendation is up 1.9% increase or $38 for the average home. 1.3% is growth from assessment. So the tax rate increase is 0.6. And that's where the 1.9% comes from. So it's a combination of assessment growth and changes to the rate, which is recommended to go from 0.815 to 0.820. Next slide, please. So this is the same slide for the impact on commercial. So we actually saw average commercial assessed value go up 2.6%. So by having an average tax increase of 1.9, the tax rate actually drops on the commercial side of things. So it would, if this recommendation was adopted, you would see the tax rate go down by 0.7%. But the tax bill would go up $817. So that's all based on assessment growth, that increase. Next slide, please. So as CFO, it's my job to point out risks to regional council. So making changes to the tax rate in this budget year, it might be relatively easy to do. We do have the $20.8 million for the loan payment, but there are downstream impacts on the next year's budget, as the CAO has pointed out. And while council votes the budget on an annual basis, it's really important to always be looking at the longer term impacts of any decision. So whether it's 4 years, 10 years, or 20 years down the road. So some of the risks to reducing the tax bill is we have to make up that lost revenue in future years. So if reduced taxes and revenue goes down by $5 million, as an example, we have to make that up next year. Our costs go up faster than inflation does, and we certainly see this on the capital side of things. Services continue to expand. It is easier to adopt a series of smaller increases as opposed to have no increases and then a big spike. So by smoothing tax rate increases, adopt it much easier. The economy has certainly been better than anyone had predicted when COVID-19 started, but the future still is uncertain. And the biggest thing, the biggest risk really is that the 21-22 budget is really benefiting from that $31 million in federal Safe Restart funding. Next slide, please. Thank you. The options for the tax rate, as Jacques pointed out, is looking at so the starting point is the 1.9. You do have options to reduce the budget. The $20.8 million short-term loan payment has been freed up. So the scenarios that we've run are to keep the tax rate at this average tax bill at the same rate as 2021. Set the average tax increase at the rate of inflation for 2021, so last year's rate of inflation, or to status quo, which is the 1.9. Next slide, please. So at the option of setting the average tax bill with zero increase, so last year's amount, this would result in a reduction of $10.8 million in lost revenue. So we can cover that through the $20.8 million. What would happen on the residential side? Tax rate decreased by 1 cent, so it goes from 81.5 cents down to 80.5. The commercial tax rate decreases by 7.7 cents from $3 down to $2.923. The concern in this, of course, is that the 21-22 budget is balanced through the $31 million federal Safe Restart money. And then looking at the life of the fiscal plan, we would have to cover $41.8 million. So it's the $31 million plus the lost $20.8 million in revenue. And the fiscal framework is already projecting a gap in each of the years. So, you know, some risk around the out years for sure with that scenario. Next slide, please. So if the tax rate is set at 0.5% for CPI for 2021, what you see is a resulting loss of $7.8 million in tax revenue. Once again, we can cover that off. The impact on residential taxes, so the average tax bill would go up $11. Tax rate decreases by 0.6 cents, so from the 81.5 cents down to 80.9. Average commercial taxes, they do increase $231, and the tax rate goes down 6.1 cents, so from $3 down to $2.939. And then all of the same cautions apply under this scenario as they did under the zero scenario. Next slide, please. So this is just the 1.9, the status quo, which has had a $38 increase for residential and $817 for commercial. And then the next slide just puts all of the options in a table format. So if you could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So under zero, tax revenue goes down $10.8 million. At CPI goes down 7.8. Status quo stays the same. Residential average tax bill, so there's no change. Under CPI, it increases by $11 versus the 38 under the recommended. Tax rate, 80.5 cents or 80.9 or 82 cents. And then on the commercial average tax bill, zero change. At CPI goes up $2.31. And then under the recommended scenario, it's $817 increase. And then you can see the impacts on the commercial tax rate. Regardless of what scenario is chosen, the commercial tax rate will actually decrease. And the reason for that, of course, is because of the growth in the commercial assessment that we have seen. So with that concludes the presentation. I want to thank you for your attention, and Jacques and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that presentation, Jane and Jacques. I really appreciate it. This has been a discussion that we've had for the past little while. At this point, we can open the floor up to questions. If you would like to ask any questions, I'm going to follow the same rules that we normally do. The first time you speak is 5 minutes, and subsequent times it's 3 minutes. And please enter whether or not you would like to speak in the chat. And go ahead, Councillor Mancini.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Jacques and Jane, thank you very much. That's been the best explanation so far in my short time on council on how the budget works, and so thank you. So all you had to do is go to the lowest common denominator, which is me, to explain these things, and we would have been so much far ahead. So it's more of a process question here. You've put 3 scenarios in front of us. Originally, the recommendations of the 1.9% increase. So how does this work? Do we go into a debate over which scenario do you want to go, and do we do a vote? Does a councillor put a motion forward, and then we debate that motion or support it or turn it down? I'm just trying to, how do we move forward? That's the part I'm not sure on. And then again, could you go back maybe, Jane, and on, obviously you put it in front of us, set the rate at a 0 increase. Well, many residents are jumping up and down and saying, oh, that's the way to go. But I really want to make sure I understand the long-term impact of doing that, or even the 0.5% again. I know Jane alluded to it, but I'm just not crystal clear on what the long-term impact of both those. Thank you.
So, Mr. Chair, I'll take the first question in terms of today. So we're just providing this to you as information today. We're not seeking any new directions. You'll recall, because really the advice stands at this point, right? So the key factor right now for us and for council is to understand what the budget adjustment list is, right? So at the end of all the business unit presentations, we're going to have a total budget adjustment list. And Jane and her team will go back and come back to council with briefing notes, working with all the business units, executive directors, briefing notes on those budget items, all those budget adjustment list items. And in the course of doing that, we're going to look at, we're going to have a narrative here with council on each one of those associated with, what is the impact, budgetary impact, what's the source of funds. It may be that it's one-time funding, it may be that it's multi-year funding that it actually will have to be dealt with by the rate. It may be reserve money. There'll be a source of funds in each one. And at the end of the day, that budget adjustment list will equal to a certain amount of money and a certain impact on both our reserves and more importantly on the tax rate itself, and on the average tax payable. And the council will have to decide whether it's in or out. So today, we're not really looking to have a different budget target, because we based all our work so far on budget on the 1.9, and I think council owes it to itself and to the public, obviously, to go through the process, come out the other end with a budget adjustment list, and then make a determination. And we can advise on that. So, the impacts, and Jane will get into more detail here, but if you'll recall, when we brought to you the fiscal framework in the out years, in 22, 23, 23, 24, 24, 25, there was actually a gap projected, right? Mm-hmm. In the range of $60 million and $70 million, et cetera, going forward. They're all assumption based. And, at the end of the day, when you look at those assumptions, it's based on what we know today. So, as we get into the detailed budget process for 22, 23, we're going to have much more current information, and we hopefully can mitigate some of that. Some of that will maybe get mitigated by the increase in the tax base for 22-23. We're a little concerned, as I mentioned in my comments, we're a little concerned about what is the current tax base going to be in 22-23, given it's based on COVID times as opposed to boom time in 2019. So that, to me, that is, so the risks are really, if you go from 1.9 say to CPI, when you take into account the $31 million and that you have to, which is funding a good chunk of some of the operations, you have to find that money somewhere else, right, or cut services. So there's quite a bit of risk associated with that, right, and just that alone. We don't know at this point whether the federal government or the province will come in with another round of restart money. We just don't know. There has been no real conversation about that yet. There may well be, depending on the impact of COVID going forward, but that is quite a serious risk. This year we're kind of fortunate that we were probably going to run a fairly healthy surplus, probably in the range of $8 to $10 million. So that will help us. The question is in 22-23, I shouldn't say it that way. In 21-22, will we actually run a surplus again, right? Because as you know, we've been, for at least the last 10 years, council has been quite aggressive in terms of cutting the budget, and so have I been. And Jane, we all, all the business unit directors have been doing a lot of work in paring down the budgets. There's not a lot of room to cut service costs without cutting service levels, right? And I can appreciate not many people want to cut service levels.
Right.
At this point, right? So on that, those are my opening comments, and maybe Jane has other things to add then. Sure.
Thank you for that, Jacques. Through you to the chair. So Councillor, when we did the fiscal framework, the gap was 80 million in 22-23, 102 million in 23-24, and 119 million in 24-25. Those are the revenue on that is very, very conservative. As Jacques said, it's based on assumptions and it's very conservative. And as well, that had the $20 million short-term loan in there. So when you take that out, the gap would be, 60 million, 80, 82 million, and then 99 million. So once again, based on conservative estimates for revenue and then inflation growth on expenses. So they're big numbers, but I don't want people to think that they're insurmountable. There is work that needs to be done to close that gap. But that's what the estimate was with the fiscal framework.
So Mr. Chair, I just want to add one more thing, and that is to Jane's point here. These are assumption based, but at the end of the day, if you do the math, in 2021, if you take budgetary capacity out in 2021, and you maintain the same service levels going forward, that capacity has to be brought in. So you end up with a spike, right? You end up with a spike in the tax rate and a spike in the tax rate payable. That's the risk, right? In a nutshell, you have to be careful not to take too much capacity out in 1 year, so that we've been trying to. And if you think about our budgets over the last, at least since I've been here, we've been running at less than inflation, right? Even though our inflationary costs are higher than CPI, like they're not the same bucket, they're not the same basket of goods. So we've been keeping the rate down significantly under inflation. And look, I'm the first one to admit nobody wants to pay more taxes, but at the end of the day, in a growing community, and I think the mayor has spoken to this before too, if you look at other municipalities across the country, they've been into 3.5 and 4s and 6s and things like that. We've been pretty good at containing our costs, but we have to be careful not to take too much capacity out, so then we end up with a larger spike in the out years, right?
Okay. Thank you very much, Jacques. Tony, at this point, you're muted. So just to let you know, and we're also past the 5 minutes, so I'm going to call on Councillor Earthit next.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Jane and Jacques. I agree that this has been a wonderful presentation, reminder for us old timers, and a little bit of a lesson for our new colleagues, and that's great. The history on this is, and I guess I take a little bit more of a pragmatic view of this, because I do believe that we don't have to make a decision today, as you've stated, Jacques, and that we need to hear from the individual units, etc., and look under the hood, as Sam says, and see what's going on. And I absolutely agree with that. But I remember when I arrived at council in 2008, and I was greeted at the door by some folks who are no longer with us, who told me I was living a dream, that I think we could ever have a smaller council and that we could ever freeze taxes. Well, we have 7 fewer councillors. We froze taxes 3 times and the world didn't end. And in fact, we're still one of the most financially strong cities in the country. So I get a little bit pragmatic, but you and Jane are doing exactly what you have to do by Jacques, by pointing out the pros and the cons, and it's appreciated. The one I want to dig into a little bit is the projected surplus of between 8 or 10 million, because that might be our opportunity. And I think the mayor has referred to this before as paying back a dividend, if you will, for those who put up with the increased traffic, the noise from the growth, this sort of thing, the D-transfer tax. So a little bit of a dividend that we didn't spend, if you will, all that we brought in, and of course we've had a little bit of an increase. So I think that, and that would not be per se taking money out of the 20.8 is actually in a reserve, and it was smart to have that reserve if we had to pay back the line of credit. No doubt there in my mind. But I'm wondering, and I think there's precedent for this, if we can nail down the surplus a little bit more, if it's going to come out between 8 or 10 million, and if we couldn't continue our process of trying to use that or a portion of that as a dividend to reduce the 1.9. And right now the 1.9 is, I mean, it's above the 1.2, the 1.3 lift, if you will, that we're getting from the assessment. And it's higher than CPI. And I think some folks are looking for some relief on that. I'm talking residential. Commercial, it would be a rate cut, and that's great. But I'm just wondering if there isn't sort of something between the 1.9 and the 0 that uses the projected surplus or portion of it, Jack or Jane.
Yeah, thanks. You, Mr. Chair, and again, I'll ask Jane to weigh in as well. But when I think about the surplus, and I mentioned, I think earlier in my comments, and I look at if you're going to use something, that's probably where you would use a portion of that. I would be cautioning you to use a significant amount of it, simply because whatever you used in this year's surplus, you're going to have to make up in the out years some way, somehow, right? So, as I mentioned earlier, we don't know whether we're going to run a surplus in 21-22. So if we did, and those expenses that are covered by the surplus this year extend into the out years, and you still have to find a revenue stream for that, right? Now, you know, if it's not a large amount, let's say it's in the $5 or $6 million range, we could probably jig and jog around that to the extent that, you know, we do have a healthy reserve balance, but, you know, as Jane points out, you know, all of these things have consequences in out years, so we'd have to do some modeling around that to show what we think could happen if we did something like that. But to me, your idea is where I would tend to go to as well. Really, the question in my mind would be the quantum. What's that? To what extent can we look at that? And how comfortable are we in terms of the impact on the out years that we can actually accommodate those or replace that revenue going forward through increased tax base? Right? Jane? All
right, and thank you. And just, I know we're also, and Jane, maybe before you speak, I know we're also concerned about the commercial assessments and revenue, of course, going forward. But then we saw some news this week, and I don't know if either you or Jacques wanted to speak on it, where the actual vacancy rates aren't as bad as they were. The rates actually went down during COVID at a time when we thought they would probably go up because of people working from home, people not taking on new space, etc. employers. So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on that, and that provides you any comfort on the outlook for other years of commercial assessments. And then my time is up. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, John.
Thank you. Over to
if Jane could respond, Chair, I'd appreciate it.
Yes, I was going to ask her to. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So on the surplus, I would agree with everything that Jacques said. The caveat that we always give is to match the revenue stream with the expense. So absolutely, if it's a one-time expense, using the surplus makes perfect sense because you've mitigated any downturn impacts. On commercial assessment, so the vacancy rate is just one component that goes into the way that the building gets assessed and the value that's assigned on net income. So it depends on if it's Class A, Class B, any number of things. I think it is positive that the vacancy rate is lower than anticipated. But what happens after the appeals is really what it's going to be there. So, cautiously optimistic. Thank you.
And that's good for an accountant. So thank you, Jane.
Okay, thank you very much. Councillor Austin. And you're muted.
There we go. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, staff. I agree with Councillor Outhit. I mean, today is this is good education. I mean, I don't ever remember having our process so well laid out in a PowerPoint presentation before. So I think this is good. I did jot some notes down along as we went. My concern would be just as we look ahead and start to look at all the departments, that we are not setting ourselves up for either some painful cuts or a rate shock later on if we go too easy this year. So the federal restart money, that one-time federal, that's allowing us to budget this year. Did I hear correctly? You're splitting that half this year and half in next year. So then the following year it's gone. Okay. So our costs go up every year. We all know that. Transit fares, we're projecting that we would be back to something pretty much normal 2 years from now. Okay. When does the assessment impacts, if there are whatever they are from COVID, a hotel that had no customers appealing their assessment, is that next year or is that the year after?
Yeah, there's a lag. There's a lag by 2 years. So you, Mr. Chair,
that starts to sound like a lot. It's 2 years out.
Yeah, well, I guess that's why Jane and I are thinking that we're not too concerned about 21, 22. I think we're in fairly decent shape. Where the unknown factor is 22, 23. So the 2020 experience in the marketplace, and so people, in the commercial market, they will appeal taxes, appeal their assessments, I should say, appeal their assessments, and they will appeal against 2020, and that appeal amount would then impact our 22-23 budget, right? So the big question mark is, and look, there's the yin and yang on this. There's the balance sheet, and there's the debit and the credit. The debit side is the fact that we'll lose money on the appeals, but the credit side is the new construction and what more revenue we're going to get, right? So you think about it that way, what's the net effect of that going to be, right? So this year's tax base, we saw great growth, and that was because it was based on 2019's experience, right? So for the 21-22 budget, right? So that 22-23 budget is going to be challenged. I think will be challenged to a certain level. We can't pin it down, but as Jane showed in the fiscal framework, we're making some assumptions there, and if the assumptions hold true, then we have a gap to fill, right? We know we had assumed there's no federal state start money. There's a lot. Plus, when you think about the transit piece, their costs are going to be there, but they're obviously the revenue is not going to recover in our view until 23, 24, and the hotel and the tourism market, basically speaking, to the same kind of effect, right? So when you think about cruise ships, they're banned from the waters until at least 22 now. How that will pan out in terms of the hotel occupancy. We're not anticipating the recovery on the hotel properties or in the restaurant market or the retail market, and how all those assessments get impacted is, I think the worst is yet to come. This winter is going to be, at the end of this winter, we're going to see a better picture of what that looks like given the impact of COVID. But we are concerned about those years for those reasons in those specific sectors, right?
Thank you, Jacques. So before I run out of time, I wanted to talk about debt. The 20 million that's in reserve, is that currently allocated?
Yes, it's built into the budget.
So we've already have that allocated into our budget. That's not found money. Okay. And so then really, if there's any found money here, it's the potential surplus of this year?
Correct.
Okay, and so we're tracking to about 8 or 10 million?
We'll be in with the Q3 report next week, and it's sitting at around 6 million, I believe.
Okay, so I'll just float this idea now to colleagues. I mean, debt is future taxes. There's a reasonable level to put debt. Rather than withdrawing money to start our strategic reserve, I think the prudent thing to do would be to take that surplus money and use that to start our strategic reserve. My 2 cents to close. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Austin. It's an interesting concept. Councillor Cuddle.
Oh, hi. Sorry, I thought the mayor was before me here. Am I good to go?
The mayor is after you. Yep.
Oh, I have a different list. All right. Sorry, I was just I'm sitting here trying to get what Councillor Austin was just talking about. I think I had very similar questions around the lag in the collection of the taxes. You know, this year is a very difficult year for us to be asking the commercial sector to be absorbing the cost of growth that incurred 3 years ago. In a year when they've had significant revenue declines, many of the small businesses, which impacts the commercial property owners. So, you know, it's not just the vacancy or the class of the building. Often the assessment of commercial properties is also geared towards the income that they generate. Is that correct?
Jane?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, so in the commercial sector, there's a number of ways that the assessed value is calculated. One of them is net income. Typically, you see that in more the shopping centers and office towers.
Yeah, so I too am greatly concerned not only about the ability of commercial to pay for previous year's assessment growth this year, but also our revenues looking 3 years out. So I am wondering, we talked about this surplus, and I think I understand it a little bit better after Councillor Austin's questions, but my question would be, is this the year to be running a surplus? And could you just talk about that again a little bit more about, why we would be projecting a surplus in a year where we really looking to keep things tight and costs down?
Certainly, Mr. Chair. So the quick answer, Councillor, it's de-transfer tax. We're actually de-transfer tax. I believe we are projecting $51 million. The market is red hot, and we did not see that coming. So in June, when we did the budget, the recast budget, we had actually had de-transfer tax at $40 million in change, because we thought in a COVID environment, people wouldn't be buying houses, there wouldn't be that risk in the market. So we were actually quite nervous. What we've seen so far, and everybody is read, is that actually de-transfer tax, we're projecting that to be where it would have been in March. So that's $10 million. The other thing, so in the third quarter projections, that takes us to December 31st. Obviously, what we haven't seen is the impact of winter. So a lot of the snow budget is under contract, of course, but there are some extra costs that, depending on how significant the winter is, we may have extra costs. So it is still a prudent surplus, and then there's always the accounting treatment in behind that impacts it too. So that's basically the reason for it in a nutshell.
Okay, thank you. So, yeah, I mean, I guess my question is in the future kind of scenario planning here, like how are we going to continue to operate within our fiscal reality amongst kind of all this uncertainty in which we're trying to plan, the next year and the next 3 years. So, I think, being conservative now is where we need to go. But the debt piece, looking at what needs to be done now? Where, are there opportunities where we can use debt now to offset costs down the road? So, be like maintenance, roads, for example. Is there a benefit of using debt to finance repairs and maintenance now to save ourselves money down the road where we know there'll be increases in costs of materials and repairs? So I'm if you could just talk a little bit about how we use our debt and what the opportunities are there. That's my final question. Thank you.
Certainly, Mr. Chair, through to the councillor. So we use debt for capital. Is the first thing. That's the only thing that we borrow for is debt. And so there are debt policies in place that really restrict where you're going to put what you're going to borrow for. So we shouldn't really, general rule of thumb, of course, we shouldn't be borrowing debt for rehabilitation. So that is what you should really be doing out of your operating budget. So that would be our capital from operating. Debt should be incurred for either assets that have a really long life, so things like recreation facilities, if we're building a new rec facility, because what you want to do is spread the payment out. You want to match the people that are going to be using the facility with the ones that will be paying the taxes. So it's intergenerational debt is what it's referred to. And then those large things. So the whole thing behind the strategic initiative funding plan is getting that debt, being able to, for those big initiatives, to have enough debt room to fund them. And then that takes pressure off the operating side of things. So it is about affordability. And it's really about, we've done a great job at driving absolute debt down. I think it's almost $100 million since amalgamation. So it's about, okay, so now growing city and region, some really significant initiatives underway, very low interest rate environment, is now the time to start growing that debt to an appropriate level. So it's about setting those levels, and we will be coming back with a debt policy that gives some recommendations on what that level should be. I hope that answered your question.
It did. Thank you very much. And I too am going to echo my colleagues and say this was a really good presentation. I greatly appreciated it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mayor Savage. And you're still on mute.
Sure. Thank you, Chair.
There we go.
And there's a little lesson in what Councillor Cuddle said about she thought she was on the list behind me. Folks, when you think you're a minute ahead of somebody else and the chair doesn't call you, it's because the lists are different. It doesn't mean anybody's got a grudge against you. So keep that in mind. Thank you very much, Jane. This is really kind of a primer for all of us on budget. It's very helpful, and I agree with that. There's a huge amount of misunderstanding about what we're doing in this process. You hear out in the community and letters and in media that we're increasing taxes 1.9%. Not that we're going through a budget process that will lead to where we're going. People think it's an increase in the tax rate of 1.9%. There's just a lot of misunderstanding, and all we can do is do our best to kind of work our way through it. I saw the other day on something that we had passed the police budget at some, we haven't even seen the police budget. So we're going through this the way that we should. We have held the line on taxes versus other municipalities very well, including others that are growing. You look at cities that have grown in the last number of years, the cities outside Toronto, cities as well like Saskatoon and others, and we have kept the line while we are helping people who actually need help. And that's the key initiatives that we need. I think we would all probably, at least certainly most of us, would love to be able to help the small businesses who are hurting, the hospitality people who've hurt from COVID. And we can, the patio piece last year was helpful. We should do it again this year. Streetscaping is important, traffic. We are doing what we can help to those who have been hurt the most. But the biggest thing we can do in many ways is on the tax front. Now, we're limited, as Jacques indicated and Jane indicated. We have collective agreements, some of which have been imposed upon us by interest arbitration. We don't have any control on that. We can't just say we're not going to accept those increases. We value our employees, but the cost of the employees is pretty high. And it's true to say that people haven't been hurt here as much by COVID as in some other areas. And we see that in December, 3,000 more people were working in Halifax than were working in the previous December. And that's great. We have 15 companies at least that have moved to Halifax during COVID. Those are all good things. But you know who else has done better through COVID than expected? HRM. We have people have been paying their taxes. I mean, 8 or 9 months ago, I sat with Jacques and Jane, and it was pretty bleak what we expected in terms of tax payment. People have paid. We did get 46 million from the province, which has been a real godsend. People are coming here. So I think what we need to do is just take today and put it in the back of our head as we start to go through these business unit presentations. And by the way, 1%, 1.9% is not bad compared to a lot of other municipalities. The question I have though is it good enough? We can fund. We saw this week a bunch of new initiatives coming out of the CAO's office on anti-Black racism, on public safety, things that we need to put money into, all within that 1.9%. So I don't have an issue so much with what goes into the expense side. But when we get all this stuff done, and all the business units and all the overs and unders, and it's usually overs that come back, then we look at the source of revenue. And Jane, my big issue for years has been deed transfer. We have been dramatically over in surplus on deed transfer for a number of years. If I look at the CanMac study, Jane, which you referenced in your presentation back in probably December, they're projecting 30 million a year more in deed transfer than we're budgeting. So we're taking the prudent approach, and I support that. But there's a potential that we will be bringing in a fair bit of money on the deed transfer. The 31 million one-time from the restart is very helpful this year, and it's not something we're going to have in out years, but the $20 million that we don't need to borrow offsets that. What I want to make sure is that this is not the year that we should be running a surplus in operating. We should, at the very least, be saying, as we get closer to the year, what is our actual surplus and what can we do with that? It came from taxpayers, and I think that we just need to be a little bit sensitive. We have a ton of great initiatives that we're going to support this year, and I just think at the very least we need to say, if we've done okay this year, other governments have gone dramatically into debt. We don't have to, but we do have to acknowledge that we can only do so much to help our citizens and our businesses in particular. So I'll wait till March, April, but I will be pushing to see what we can do to keep the tax rate as low as possible. And if possible, hold the line while not sacrificing services. And as I said this week, I think there's a good chance we can do it all together, expressing our points of view with openness in our hearts and malice toward none. I think Abraham Lincoln might have said that, something like that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Jane. I believe there was a question there for you about the surplus.
Definitely we will be looking at that. My understanding from the mayor was to keep an eye on and to repay the dividend, as he said in previous years. So that would be part of the mix and a funding plan that would come back.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Councillor Smith.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Jane and Jacques, for this working team. Not just you two, obviously, the folks that are crunching the numbers behind the scenes. So appreciate all the work on that. And as mentioned, this presentation, even though we've got similar in the past, for some reason this one felt differently in a good way. So if there was a way to make this a 30-second or 1-minute condensed video that we could put up to the public with cartoons or whatever is needed to be done, I think that'd be great. So folks can truly understand, how we operate pretty much as households do, just obviously with a bigger budget. So if that could be thought about, and if there's any money in the budget to do something really simple as that, I would love to see that and be happy to share it. Also, really quickly to give a big shout out to our past colleague, Bill Karsten, past president of FCM, around the Safe Restart money, because he was very influential with FCM to work with the federal government and getting that money there. So just a big shout out to Bill Karsten and the work he did at FCM for that. So really my two questions, one is the 19 million shortfall, as we're calling it, and we're looking at the 1.9. When you obviously will understand as we go forward, but when you think about or when you look at the budget, what is that mostly accounted for, either through capital or through operating? So where are you seeing that 19 really come into the shortfall? And the other piece too, and as mentioned, we have the surpluses and we've held the line before in the past. But as we saw last budget before COVID, and then obviously we had to recast it, that when we do hold the line, we have to pay for it in the end. So we might do it now, which would be great, because I understand this is a pandemic year, but in the future we're going to have to look at how we're going to catch up with us holding that line, because we are seeing that significant growth. So that's also something that I'll mention to our colleagues is, I think 1.9, considering what's happening, is not that bad. I'd love to see it lower, but we have to also realize whoever's at this table, we're going to be having difficult conversations, and that 1.9 could be something else. I won't even mention the number. So really the question is just the 19 million, where are you seeing a lot of that come from? And then if you want to comment on the last piece, you can, but you don't have to.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the 19 million is a number of different things. So we restored a lot of the cuts that we made from the COVID budget. So that was about 22 million. There's operating costs that have gone up by about 17 million. So those are things like, remember, the organics solid waste contract got approved, and then just the normal contracts that go through. Capital is another $39 million, and these are all from the June budget. And then we had some savings where we put money aside for COVID contingency, deed transfer tax, and then the federal assistance. So we take all of the expenses that have gone up, and the majority of those are, well, do you know what? It's actually split pretty evenly as I look at the math right now between operating and capital. And then we look at the increased revenues that are going to come in. And that's how we came up with, ended up with a shortfall of 19.3 million. And within that would have been the $6 million reduction for business units. So that's all in the fiscal framework presentation that I did. If you're looking for that and in the document. So that's really how it all comes together. It's really hard to point to one or two places and say what it is. So it's pretty even, actually, when I looked at it.
Okay. Thank you very much, Councillor Mason.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I want to start by saying thank you for a great presentation to staff and a great conversation with colleagues around the council chamber. I'm going to take a slightly different tack and suggest that I'll be very brief on this. I think councillors should go have a look at the Halifax Partnership COVID recovery webpage, which has all sorts of information about where the economy is really at month by month, going back to January. And while there are undeniably challenges in the economy, especially for certain sectors of retail and certain sectors of the hospitality industry, we actually have, as of January, 4,600 more people working than we did this time last year. And across the whole range of the things that they're measuring, employment by age, there are some challenges, but overall it's up. employment by sex. The gender gap has closed, and now they're actually both equally employed and better than they were a year ago. You look at the industries, and certainly some are still struggling, but some are actually vastly exceeding where we thought we would be at this point in terms of industrial employment and retail sale employment. Personal debt has gone down. So we are in a position where COVID has a real and lasting impact on how we live our lives, and has very negatively impacted some very select businesses. But overall, the economy is actually doing very well. It's doing about as well as you would have expected if there wasn't COVID. It's just that the distribution has changed, and that isn't really a just, which is why AMA and Nova Scotia Federation of Municipalities and Halifax Partnership have been going to the province since April, saying what we don't want is to have to be under pressure to keep taxes low or have broad relief. We need the ability to do targeted relief. Either the province or they give legal ability for the municipalities to provide relief where it's needed. Restaurants, bars, hotels, tourism-based businesses. So I strongly encourage people to have a look at that. My concern here when we're talking about possibly using some of the surplus or even debt is we know we already have a structural deficit, right? We know that because we have done enterprise asset management and Fleet HQ and pavement and the information Jacques already given us, and we're $10 million down on what we should be paving just to maintain the roads alone. We have in our fleet of trucks that are 25 years old, that should probably have been replaced at 15. We have tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars in when you add it all up between buildings and fleet and the physical plant of the municipality, roads and sidewalks. We already have a huge gap. And so, I said when the budget approach was presented that I appreciate the conservative approach, especially around deed transfer tax and the potential for having surpluses, because we are not budgeting to adequately bring our reserves up, but we are budgeting conservatively so that if and when we get these, excessive deed transfer taxes or revenue comes in higher than we thought on any of these areas, that we then have the capacity to start putting the money away that we know we need to toward this structural deficit and these reserves that we need to have. So, I guess what I'm trying to say is the money that we might use to keep taxes low now, not only does that create an issue of the knock-on effect and having to pay the piper next year or the year after with a much more significant tax increase. We've already spent the money effectively, in my mind, by saying we really need to put this into the reserves because we've already identified the huge gap in our reserves. So I'm just saying all this, especially keeping in mind all the new councillors, just knowing how many moving pieces there are. And I'll just close by saying, this is no good deed goes unpunished, right? We have had, of the medium-sized cities in the country, the lowest annual tax, not tax rate change, media, but lowest increase in the tax bill of a medium or major-sized city in Canada for, 8-9 years now? And so what that means is, arguably, we have less capacity to not continue to do that because we've been so conservative in our budgeting for so long. We don't have a lot of wiggle room. We've been very, very, we've really focused on trying to keep our costs down and keep it, do all the things that we're now talking about now, we have in fact been doing. So I'm open to the discussion when we get to the balance list, but I'm just concerned that we keep all these other things in mind because we have ambitions that are going to cost money in the future, and we don't want to rob that future now. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, or Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. I just would like to address the issue of the structural deficit for a second. One of the things that we see when we're talking about a structural deficit is something that would increase the debt year over year, and we don't have that. So I disagree in the opinion that we have a structural deficit at this point. I'm going to hand it over to Jane. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wasn't aware that there was a question in there.
And I will simply say I withdraw the term structural deficit, and I will use the new term technical deficit, which has been started to be used by economists. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. Councillor Morris. Kathy, you're muted.
Sorry. Thank you for the presentation. It's really helpful to have this context and to understand a little bit more about the assumptions that are going into the budget process. I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit more about borrowing and the time that we find ourselves in. And you mentioned historic lows and that sort of thing. I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the trends and why this might not be a bad time to borrow.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, through you to the committee. So there's a couple of things at play. What we're seeing in the economy is that interest rates are low, and Bank of Canada and all the other federal reserves are saying that those are going to stay low. So it is a good time to do that, because what we do, the way we borrow in Nova Scotia municipalities, we have to go through the province, through the Nova Scotia Municipal Finance Corporation, and it is a very traditional borrowing structure. So if you say that you're going to, you want to borrow for a 20-year term, you lock that rate in for 20 years. So what that does is that gives you certainty on what your principal and interest payments are going to be. So, you know, on the one hand, it's very restrictive, but on the other hand, you do get some benefits on that. And the rate that we borrow is the province's cost of borrowing plus, I think it's 25 basis points. So it is a competitive rate. So that gives us some certainty there. The other thing that means that it's a good time to borrow is that the work that's been done by previous councils and previous CAOs and CFOs in really driving down the absolute debt amount. So that's come down a fair amount. But then if you have that, and then you couple that with the growth, the really significant growth that Halifax has been seeing from a revenue side and population, you know, you're having that much more potential revenue come in. So really, when you put all the factors together, there is room in that. So our debt service ratio, I think, is 4.6 or 4.7%. That's very low. Like, so it's really about, is now the time, given economic conditions, given growth that we're seeing in HRM, coupled with the aspirations and the big initiatives that we have underway.
And we would be able to lock in at probably the lowest rates ever. Is that right?
I would say they're low. They're definitely, I think the cost of 10-year borrowing in the spring was like 2.57. It was definitely under 3. It was definitely under 3 for 10 years. You know, and all you need is to have a spike occur, and basically, if that occurs, if the interest rate goes up above that, you're actually making money because your savings are higher than your debt, and that's a good day.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Chair, I would just add this to your point about borrowing, and just to build on what Jane is saying, and we've been saying all along. Our capital spend is not enough to meet the aspirations that Jane's talking about, and the state of good repair and all the other things that we need to do on the capital side. So when you think about the borrowing piece of it, you know, outside of capital from operating, which was, you know, generally we try to fund state of good repair stuff, but sometimes you know, state of good repair means replacing an entire building. You know, in the end of the day, it's replacing assets. So when you think about our capital spend, we've been averaging, you know, our capital target spend is about $150 million a year. You'll see in the capital budget that we're going to be proposing a $230 million average spend, right? It's that time where we have reached time where we cannot meet aspirations, we cannot meet our capital requirements at that level of funding. So when you see, I'm just giving everyone that assurance that we've been thinking about this and looking very hard at this across all business units with all the executive directors and saying, okay, if we're going to actually meet our capital needs here, we need to actually increase the spend. And yes, that will probably take on more debt, but it's going to be, to Jane's point, it's going to be smart debt, it'll be targeted debt, it'll be manage debt, right? So we're not looking to add debt for the sake of adding debt because of the low interest rates. We're looking at it because it's on a needs basis and to meet all the aspirations and everything else that we're trying to do around here, right?
Okay, thank you very much. Councillor Daigle-Gammon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you for the presentation. It was just lovely. And I agree with Councillor Smith when he said, is there a way that we can make this public every year, a month before, and then 3 weeks and 2 weeks before budget talks? Because I think I had said once before, it's a brave thing to do your budgets and discussions in public. So if they know in advance about how our processes are, I think it would help us all a little bit. The other thing is, when we talk about this budget and the target of what that 1.9% gap would be, or the gap would be funded by 1.9%, it's within the context of business units being asked to reduce or to come within a target of, I believe, was it a 25% reduction? No, it was, but there was a target that the business units had to come in, and it was a reduction, though. I think I remember hearing that. So I'm just wondering, have we asked any of the business units to, be in a position where they can't do everything that they need to do? And I think the other question I had was a little bit about, it went to Councillor Morse's comments about, is this the time, could this be the time to use debt? And I am concerned that when we look at what we need to do, and the whole thing about safer communities and safer streets, and the work that people are still waiting to see happen in this municipality. So I'm just wondering, when are we going to be able to start addressing that gap in roads and water and infrastructure maintenance and repair and all of those kinds of big issues that everybody has literally in their own neighborhoods, and I want to see a change. Thank you.
I'm going to hand it over to Jane for that response. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr.
And Jane, you just glitched.
Oh.
There you are. You're back.
Oh, okay. Thanks. So actually, the business units were asked to reduce their targets by $6 million. I'm getting a bad network message. Am I still good?
You are at this point, yes.
Okay. And actually, there's only 2 business units whose budget actually went down. That's corporate customer service and HRP over the June. All the other business units had an increase in their budget. But it's not as much as when I say they think they need, I don't mean that in a negative way, but the way that they estimate what they need. So there is a reduction to their what you would say, I guess, fully funded, and that's what the unders are, the reductions. As far as the where you're going to see the service delivery and the roads and the infrastructure investments, that will come in the capital presentation, which will lay that out. Every single project that is in the capital book, which we will have, I hope, next week, has a funding source assigned to it. So every time we put a project in there, and I think there's well over 200, if not 300, we have identified where the funding is going to come from. So is it reserve? Is it capital from operating? Is it debt? We put cost sharing in as well, of course. So that is all laid out in there, and it all gets put in the mix for the for both the operating and the capital budget for fiscal sustainability going out, which some of the things that Jacques had referenced. I don't know if you want to add to that at all, Jacques?
No, I think you've got it. You've got it. I don't think I can add much more to that at this point. Yeah. The budget book will, the capital budget book, as Jane points out, will be landing on your desk in somewhat of a thud next week, only because it's quite voluminous, and it'll be a paper document. So it'll land on your desks, and we certainly encourage you to read through every one of those sheets so you understand what we're trying to do here. It'll have everything in there from Parks and Rec, state and good repair stuff, to new projects, roads and streets, and buildings and facilities, etc.
Thank you very much. I look forward to it.
Okay. I believe that's everything is, Kathy, are you okay?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Great, thank you. My list of speakers is empty if anybody would like to speak again. And I see Tim waving his hand instead of typing into the chat, so go ahead, Tim.
I'm going to give you a hand gesture. Yeah. With all my fingers. So just, Jane, if you could just clarify, I'm just continuing on where Kathy was, because I know we're all very concerned about the condition of our roads, and we're all very concerned about this 300, and there's another 180 to be added to that once they're evaluated, about street calming, traffic calming, this sort of thing. So a few minutes ago, we mentioned that while we call it a capital expense, we call building roads, repairing roads, building speed bumps, putting in chicanes, whatnot, we call those capital projects. You don't usually use those things, do those sorts of things, I think you said, out of capital reserves, though, because that's kind of considered state of good repair, I guess, or something. But can you help me understand that? Because I think it's a very interesting point that if we want to not have big tax increases, but we want to start attacking this deficit, if you will, of our roads and our and of course all of us concerned with the safety, street safety and complete streets, is there not an opportunity to use a capital reserve to help put a dent in that?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, through to the councillor. So what I was referring to debt, councillor. I said that typically, you know, you wouldn't fund state of good repair. That's what we call pay as you go, and that's part of the capital operating. You can use capital reserves. The business case allows for things. So really, it's about everything that's in the mix and what makes the most sense for that. We have, I believe, in the past used debt to do renewal projects. It just really depends on how big the renewal project is and the fiscal capacity.
Right, and that makes sense. I just wanted that clarification, just because while it's an opportunity and it has been done, it's not a common use. We think of it more when we're building an arena, building a, you know, such and such a thing, to have a library, what have you, to start using reserves. But that potential is there if we 2 or 3 years from now we're still saying we still have a list of 300 or 400 streets waiting for work, hundreds of streets waiting for speed bumps. That potential is there in theory, but not necessarily advisable. Is that fair?
Yeah, so I mean, that would be accurate. You would look at everything. The business case for capital assets is would allow for it. I mean, it is a funding source, and you just have to look at the full mix.
Yeah, no, and I'm not suggesting it at the moment. I was just looking for a little clarification. I don't want you to start banging your head on the desk quite yet. Thanks, Jane. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much. I would also like to echo everybody else's comments. Thank you very much for the presentation. It was comprehensive. It was informative. It was helpful. It brought everybody up to the same page, not just those involved in the meeting, but those watching it from afar. I don't have anybody else speaking or to list in the chat, so I'm just going to take a couple of minutes and comment on the earlier comments that we made about a structural deficit. And the comment was made offline that it could be an infrastructure or a maintenance deficit, and I would see that we would certainly have that. Councillor Outhet mentioned the state of good repair, and I see that we could improve the state of good repair. I don't think we should use reserve or debt for that because it is an ongoing expense. I would see reserve or debt being used for one-time items, for new projects that we're doing. And that is the essence of my notes. If anybody else would like to say anything, that would be great. Otherwise, I believe we are finished for the day, and I would like to thank Jacques and Jane, and certainly Bruce Fisher as well, for putting together the presentation. And if there's nothing else, I would ask for a motion to adjourn.
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
Okay, I heard Councillor Cuddle first. Thank you very much, everybody. And I hope you have a good rest of the day and a good weekend.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.